Policing TV and this edition of Talking Crime with me, Danny Shaw. And I'm delighted to say that I'm joined today by a Dame Sara Thornton, who's the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, and before that, of course, had a distinguished record in the police service for over 30 years. Sara Thornton, thank you very much for joining us on Policing TV. It's now almost 3 years since you started as Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner. Now, the remit of your role is to encourage good practice in the prevention, detection, investigation and prosecution of modern slavery offences and the identification of victims. How far do you think you've achieved that or made an improvement in that?
Oddly enough, the other day I came across my cards that I prepared for my interview for this job just over 3 years ago. And I was able therefore to analyse how I'd done against what I'd set out when I pitched to the Home Secretary at the time. And I think in terms of a focus on prevention, I'm really pleased with what we've done. Modern slavery and human trafficking are economic crimes. They're about people making money. So a lot of what we've done is think about what are the structures, particularly the economic and business structures that lie behind it. So I've done a lot of work looking at supply chains, the role of businesses, the role of financial services, the role of insurance, and we've written reports, we've done roundtables, international roundtables, and I think really got a good response from business. I mean, on 2 occasions, I've written out to chief execs of the biggest companies and the biggest banks, and they've responded and responded well. So that I'm really pleased about. I also wanted to make a real focus on what works, on thinking about all that research and evidence that sits in universities and how we can bridge between what's done in the research world and what's happening in terms of policy and practice. And again, I'm really proud of lots of different partnerships and events and papers we've commissioned and roundtables and conferences. So that's been really good. But I guess the focus from a police perspective is how have we supported victims and how have we done in terms of investigation and prosecution. Well, over the period, the number of victims continues to increase, the number identified. And a lot of that is about better awareness and better knowledge. I worry that the response isn't as good as it needs to be, particularly once victims have been identified. They sit in the system for an average of nearly 2 years before a decision's made about whether they've been trafficked or not, so that's not good. In terms of prosecutions, what I found is the number of police investigations has been going up and up, but the ability to convert an investigation into a prosecution was where I was really concerned, because the number of prosecutions is pretty low. Just in the nick of time, before I finish, I was with the police and the Crown Prosecution Service last week, and I think up until the end of September last year, we have had over 400 prosecutions in the rolling year, the highest number for quite a long time. So that's encouraging. But what I've learned in this job is that these cases of modern slavery and human trafficking are complex, they're complicated to investigate, they often have international aspects, huge amounts of financial data, communications data, and when I look at how long the cases are taking, 2 or 3 years to get to trial. So one of the things I've really hoped to do is when we actually do prosecute cases, what can we learn about prevention from those cases, and we've done quite a bit of work on that.
While you've been doing your job, you've presumably gone around the country, you've met people, you've met victims of trafficking and slavery. Has that had an impact on you and the way that you've carried out your role?
Yes, of course it has. Of course, the pandemic came, nearly a year into my role, so that reduced the amount of face-to-face contact. But before that, and in times when we could meet people, and since then, I have made it a priority to meet victims and survivors. And that's important because I think it helps just to remind you why it's so important. When you listen to people and you meet people and you realise the extent of their trauma, it makes me determine that we should do as much as we can to prosecute traffickers, but it also makes me determine that we should be thinking about how do we prevent this in the first place. And the other thing that has been really important is it's not just about empathy and understanding, it's also about what we can learn from survivors. And one of the big issues in the study of modern slavery, for example, is that Survivors are not just people to be interviewed about what happened to them. They're about people who can help you produce knowledge. They need to be the researchers, the peer researchers themselves. And I'm really pleased at the moment that we have a survivor working in this office on a part-time basis, doing a project on the mental health of survivors, and that's really important, that if we're going to be thinking about survivors, writing about them, we should involve them in the work.
As you say, the number of victims who are referred to the Home Office scheme, which identifies and then gives them support, or identifies if they need support, has gone up. I think when you began in 2019, in that quarter, there were less than 2,000. The latest quarter, I think it's over 3,000. So it's clearly going up. But you regard that as a good thing because you think that shows that they're more confident to come forward, or the authorities are picking them up and identifying them. It's definitely, in your view, a good thing that there are more victims, as it were, in the system.
It is. Slavery and trafficking are largely hidden crimes. Often when one comes across a victim, they might not even appreciate that they are a victim. So the need for police officers, for border force officials, for social workers in local councils to understand what they're looking for, to identify the issue, and then to report and refer people to the national referral mechanism is absolutely key. And I would say that a lot of it is about making sure people do understand what the issues are so they're able to refer. I think we are still nowhere near identifying the number of victims that exist in this country.
A report from the Centre for Social Justice estimated that there were over 100,000 victims. Is that a kind of rough figure that you agree with?
Yes, and that's not the highest figure. The Global Slavery Index a few years ago suggested there were 136,000
in the UK.
In the UK, yeah, and that's our share of the 40.3 million across the globe. The 100,000 figure, I think, is probably closer to it, but I do think understanding the prevalence of slavery and trafficking is really important, and I'm very keen to encourage a variety of different universities who are looking at this to do some more work. It is complicated. You have to do multiple systems estimates, put a lot of effort into it, but I think it's really important to understand just how big a problem is that we're dealing with.
Now, when a victim comes forward and they're part of those figures, you've said already that you're concerned that there's sort of delays in the Home Office sort of approving them eligible for support is taking too long. Can you tell me a little bit about that process and what your particular concerns are, as well as how long it's taking?
So until I really got into this role, I didn't understand exactly how the system works, and I suspect a lot of police officers don't understand that. But as well as any work you might be doing to investigate the crime and to bring the perpetrators to justice, if you have a potential victim of modern slavery, and if they're an adult and they consent, they should be referred to the National Referral Mechanism. And that's a form of safeguarding support which is run by the Home Office, and it does two things really. Through its main contractor, which is the Salvation Army, and a host of other subcontractors, will provide support for victims. So if they've got nowhere to live, that could be safe houses. If they have somewhere to live, they'll be provided with what's known as outreach support. So a special caseworker who will help them with maybe health issues, legal issues, sort of trauma issues, counselling issues, so a whole range of support services. But at the same time as that, because of our international obligations, the state has a role in deciding whether somebody is a victim of trafficking. And what happens at the beginning of the process, I'm trying not to make this too complicated, is a reasonable grounds decision that somebody might be. And then the matter is looked into by caseworkers, and then at the end of the process there'll be a conclusive grounds decision that on the balance of probabilities this person is a victim of modern slavery. The problem with that process is the average time is well over 500 days now.
500 days?
Yes, it's getting on for 2 years. That's the average. And some
before
people...
before definitively saying this
Correct.
person is a victim of slavery, trafficking or whatever.
Correct.
Yeah.
So that's the average.
And in the meantime, they do receive some support?
In the meantime, they will receive support via the Salvation Army contract, or as I say, if they're not destitute, if they've got somewhere to live, they will have an outreach supporter who will provide help and care and a little bit of financial support as well.
So what difference does it make once a decision has finally been made? Do they get a higher level of support, and if the Home Office determines that they're not actually a victim, does that support then drop away?
So if they are not a victim, so if they have a negative conclusive grounds decision, then support over a short period of time is withdrawn. If they have a positive decision, it doesn't automatically entitle a survivor to anything. However, there are two areas where it's important. One is if somebody is claiming asylum in this country. Now, if you have a positive conclusive grounds, you don't automatically get asylum, but it would be something that would be taken into account when those decisions are being made. The other really important area is if somebody's accused of a criminal offence. So if you're accused of a criminal offence, which you argue is caused by the fact you yourself are a victim of trafficking and you are compelled to commit that offence, then you might have an excuse in law. Again, it's not automatic that if you've got a positive conclusive grounds, you automatically won't get prosecuted, but it's something along with other information that the prosecutors are absolutely obliged to take into account.
So how can the process be speeded up? What would you like to see happen?
At the moment, in 10 local authority areas, there is a pilot where those decisions for children are being made locally. And we are nearly a year into the pilot, and the decisions are being made so much more quickly, you know, in, 20, 30 days. There is a high degree of assurance that you've got the right people round the table who know the child, who are making the decision in the child's best interests.
And who's making those decisions locally? Is it someone in the local authority? Is it?
Working with police and other partners. It's a kind of safeguarding partnership locally.
And would you like to see that rolled out?
I'd like to see that rolled out for all children. I mean, we've got to wait for the evaluation, but I'm very hopeful that the evaluation will be positive, and I'd like to see that for all children. But I also think we shouldn't stop there, and I think we should look at how we might have that sort of approach for adults. What other crime do you have apart from the Home Office deciding whether somebody's a victim or not? It's quite an unusual arrangement. And I would say that, you know, understanding what happens, they're broadly safeguarding roles and responsibilities. And who does safeguarding normally? It's local partners, it's local safeguarding partners. They're the ones with the expertise. And I think it would make much more sense for that eventually to be devolved.
Have you told the Home Office that?
Yes.
And their response?
So, you see, when I came into post, they kept saying to me, we're going to reform, we're going to improve, we're going to make our decision making better and speedier. And for time I went along with that. And my position now, particularly after a recent report by the Centre for Social Justice, which just laid bare how long and tortuous this process was, I just said, look, I think I've come to the conclusion that it cannot be done centrally by the Home Office.
What is it about the Home Office doing it centrally that means it takes longer than people in local authorities and local areas, local partners do it?
So part of it is because the numbers are being up and up and up. And I don't think they predicted that. So there has been a lag on resourcing all the time. To be fair to the Home Office, in the last year or so, they have recruited a couple of hundred extra decision makers, but it's always lagging behind. But it's also because you've got caseworkers in Leeds or Birmingham who are constantly trying to get information from police or prosecutors or local councils all over the country. And it's that sort of constant communication. It's a much more complex process with more stages in it, and I just think that makes it longer. And also, you know, for children's social care locally are already looking after the children. That's their statutory responsibility. Surely it makes sense for the decision making to go alongside that responsibility for care and support.
Let's look at investigations. You said that there are signs that there are some more prosecutions coming on, but the number of investigations is still incredibly low. The Centre for Social Justice report that you referred to said the system is failing and not fit for purpose. The National Crime Agency has estimated there are 6,000 to 8,000 offenders. People are committing slavery offences, and yet the number of convictions are in double digits. So what needs to happen in terms of investigations and prosecutions?
The number of investigations has been going up. My real concern is the ability to convert thousands of investigations, 2,000 or 3,000 a year, into prosecutions. And I think the rolling year to the end of September was about 400 prosecutions, which is the highest it's been for quite a while. But I completely agree that that's not high enough. And of course, the traffickers see the rewards as high and the risks as low. And you know, we do need to think about how we can be much more effective at prosecuting to deter. But of course, I know from spending time listening to investigators, we've written several reports on these issues. These are difficult investigations. And apart from the fact they need to be a priority, you know, I also believe, having listened to the investigators, it's not something that a non-expert investigator can do easily. And there is a strong correlation between those forces that have dedicated teams and those that have most prosecutions.
Which forces have dedicated teams?
Well, the Met, for example, has a very good dedicated team. Greater Manchester has a dedicated team. West Yorkshire has a dedicated team. And you can see that the results very clearly there. And there was work done by the Cabinet Office a few years ago which showed the correlation between that sort of expertise, that commitment to expertise and results. But also, it is about thinking about how can we deal with these difficult offences. I've been very keen to encourage financial investigation. So, you know, if this is about an economic crime, you know, the old adage, follow the money, is absolutely pertinent here. We don't do enough financial investigation, full stop, across all organised crime in my view, but particularly with regard to modern slavery and human trafficking. I've written a couple of reports saying, you know, you must, when you're doing these investigations, think about allocating a financial investigator. What have we got in the SARS databases that can help us to investigate these crimes? How can we identify the assets? How can we restrain the assets? I partly would advocate doing that because it's great evidence for conviction, but also because it's really important we think about how can we give back to victims the money that's been stolen from them.
You worked in policing for several decades, so you must understand where the obstacles, where the blockages are. Where are they?
So, talking about financial investigation, it's always been a Cinderella. And one of the things that we have said to the National Crime Agency is, you know, you keep the records of the number of financial investigators across the country. Can you keep the records on an ongoing basis so we can at least see whether they're going up or down? Because one of the arguments is that these skills are really highly valued in the private sector. So people get trained up, get experience, and then they're off to earn more money. That might be true, but we don't know for sure because nobody's keeping the data and monitoring it on a 3-monthly or 6-monthly basis. So, you know, I've argued very strongly we need to do that. But we also need to make sure that financial investigation skills are much more broadly trained across investigators. I was talking to the Americans the other day. You know, they're Homeland Security people, a lot of their investigative units, financial investigation is just part of what you do as a detective. And I don't think it's ever been the case in the UK. So I've been really, really keen to encourage that. And the National Crime Agency has responded well. They've put out kind of instructions through their threat structures. I know they held a conference a few months ago, had about 200 officers talking about these issues and spreading the good practice. I mean, one of the things that I've come across is that there is a body called the GIMLIT. Now, you've probably never heard of it. No. The Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force. Basically, if you're an SIO and you're dealing with a case of modern slavery and there are kind of this information you think that financial services might have, banks, insurance companies, whatever, you can bring your case to the operational arm of the GIMLIT, and using kind of the legal gateways that we have to share intelligence, you can say, look, this is what we've got. What have you got? What information, what intelligence have you got that can help us to investigate this crime and bring somebody to justice? I think Met officers know about it, the City of London officers know about it, but many other forces across the country will never have accessed the GIMLIT.
Is part of the reason, is there still a sort of, I don't know, a barrier to really understanding what the crime is and what it entails? And is that something to do with the title of modern slavery? do you think that people associate slavery with something from centuries ago, people in chains, in dungeons or whatever, or something like that, whereas we're talking a lot about perhaps county lines gangs, trafficking, illegal immigration, so on, forced labour. Is there something in that, in the title, do you think, or is that too simplistic?
It's a contested issue, I would say. Modern slavery is the term we use in the UK, and it's very much in the Modern Slavery Act. And if you look at Hansard, you will see when that bill was being debated, there was a discussion about whether slavery was the correct title. In most parts of the world, so the Americans will talk about trafficking in persons, a lot of countries in Europe will talk about THB, trafficking in human beings. We use the term slavery, the Australians do, but actually it's not widespread. And the argument which I buy is that the use of the word slavery is shocking, and that actually what happens to individuals is shocking, and there is some value in that, and that's the approach we took. The other complexity is that we use it as a bit of an umbrella term. So it will include slavery, it will include domestic servitude, it will include forced labour.
So someone working in a nail bar, who's forced to work in a nail bar, forced to work in a car wash.
Forced to work in a brothel.
Regard that as slavery, would
well, okay, so it's very, very broad. The other issue which you're hitting upon now is that there's not a nice kind of clear line between what is slavery and what's just kind of labour abuse and not paying people the right pay, or not taking their health and safety seriously, or not having a contract. It's a very fuzzy line. What I would say, it becomes forced labour when that labour isn't given voluntarily. So maybe somebody's passport has been taken off them, their bank details, that they're not free to leave, that they're in debt, probably in debt bondage to their employer. But it's a very kind of fuzzy line.
But I think if you ask most people, perhaps they wouldn't regard someone in that situation as a slave.
And they might not necessarily be. They might just be in a situation where they
can't get out.
They can't get, But okay, when you get to a situation where somebody is not giving their labour voluntarily and they can't leave, then you're into situations of forced labour, which is a form of slavery. But there's also an awful lot of labour abuse that happens before that, where people aren't paid the minimum wage, they haven't got a contract, they haven't got the right health and safety equipment. That might not necessarily be slavery or forced labour. One of the things that you can look at modern slavery through a criminal justice lens, which is what police and the criminal justice system does. But there's also a big argument which says actually this is a labour rights issue, this is a workers' issue. And so the International Labour Organization has a view about what are the signs of forced labour, but a lot of them are just about, or not just about, they are about forms of labour abuse that don't in themselves amount to forced labour, if that makes sense. I'm sorry, it is very complicated.
It's still a debate, clearly. It doesn't look like the title is going to change anytime soon, but it's still one's open for discussion. Now, I want to turn to something that I know you've been lobbying about, which is a proposed change of legislation in the Nationality and Borders Bill, Clause 62, which would disqualify potential victims of modern slavery with criminal records from protection. What are your concerns about that? Because there might be a lot of people who would say, well, if you've committed a crime, why should you get protection from the state?
And the first thing I probably should say, as an independent commissioner, I don't lobby. I kind of put facts and information out there. It's for other people to use them politically. The concern is that Clause 62 suggests that in certain cases where people have criminal records, that they won't be supported through the national referral mechanism. And I have a concern straight away. It's like an in-principle concern that do we really want to have deserving and undeserving victims? I think that's a slippery slope. But particularly with regard to modern slavery and human trafficking, we know that very often when victims do give evidence, they will have criminal records. Sometimes because they've been forced to commit crimes when they've been trafficked, but actually because maybe having a criminal record makes somebody vulnerable in the first place. And different charities have made different estimates, but maybe up to about a third of all victims who give evidence in the Crown Court would fall foul of this. And so my view, as we've already discussed, is there's few enough prosecutions already. Why are you going to sort of reduce your ability to prosecute by withdrawing support from people who would give great evidence in court?
What's the reasoning for this change, for this reform, do you think?
The government believe that people who shouldn't do so are claiming to be victims of modern slavery and are abusing the system, and this is an attempt to try and clamp down on that abuse.
Is there some evidence of that?
It's very hard to say. What the government have published is evidence which says that of the people leaving immigration removal centres over the last 3 years, the percentage that are leaving because they're potential victims of modern slavery has gone from 3% to 17%. However, my argument is that doesn't mean it's necessarily an abuse. That might mean that you're just better identifying potential victims of modern slavery, because at the same time they had been criticised for not identifying vulnerable victims. There was a review called the Stephen Shaw Review, which set up special, I think they're called detention engagement teams in immigration enforcement to look for victims and to look for vulnerability. So one could argue that they've just been very effective at it. So that's the kind of view that the Home Office have put forward, and ministers have put that view forward in Parliament while defending the legislation. I just don't think it's necessarily evidence of abuse. It just means it's being used more frequently. But that's the background. But the third issue about Clause 62 is that most human rights lawyers would say that what is being proposed by the government is not consistent and compliant with our international obligations under the European Convention Against Trafficking. So I have a suspicion that even if the law is passed, it will be subject to litigation in the courts.
It's going through Parliament at the moment, and presumably there may be an opportunity for amendments to come in. Are you optimistic that it may get deleted or amended in such a way that it's less intrusive?
So there was an amendment in the Commons which was withdrawn. There are several amendments in the Lords. We're between committee and report stage in the Lords, so we're going to see whether there are forced to votes. But certainly there are amendments on Clause 62, and quite a few Lords spoke very strongly, raising the similar sort of concerns that I'm raising.
Now I want to turn to your previous life. You spent, I don't know, 3 decades in policing or more, possibly 4.
I'm not that old.
In a range
three and a bit.
3 and a bit, sorry. In a range of roles. But I don't think there's any doubt that policing at the moment is facing a bit of a crisis of confidence. It's been rocked by a series of scandals and events. The murder of Sarah Everard by a serving police officer, the Daniel Morgan inquiry, police officers sharing inappropriate images, taking selfies at murder scenes, a whole range of things, and not just in the Met but also other forces as well. How sort of worried are you about the sort of lack of confidence in policing, particularly in some communities?
I'm very concerned about it. You know, I live and work in London, so very much have that sense of the concern in London, but I completely accept your point that it's not just a London issue. I was looking at the data on this because sometimes it's really important we don't just look at the crisis that's currently happening and what's been in the news, but look at the kind of the broader picture. And if you look at confidence in policing, most of the period I was chief, I was just lucky that confidence was going up until about 2012, 2013. It then begins to plateau, and then from about sort of 2016 onwards begins to drop. And if you look at the drop where we've got data, and we've certainly got better data in London, a substantial drop in the last couple of years. So I think if you look at a longer sort of arc of history on this, there is an issue, and I think we need to be concerned about it. It's an issue around maybe minority communities, around younger people, around women. So I do think we need to take it very, very seriously.
So what can be done? Obviously, I know you're not in the position now to make decisions or make policy, but you've probably got some views.
When I was chief in Thames Valley, the Code of Ethics was published by the College of Policing. And I thought that was a really important approach, because it wasn't just about focusing on the bad apples, the egregious examples of bad behaviour, but it's about saying right across the board, how do we encourage ethical behaviour in the organisation? How do we encourage those sorts of ethical conversations? What do we do as leaders to kind of lead in an ethical fashion? So we did a lot of work on that, and I think that's really important. You don't just focus on the problem area, on the discipline, but you think about how as an organisation, because if we get those basics right for everybody, I do believe it's less likely that the more serious situations arise. So that would be one part. The second part, it strikes me about that confidence data, that it began to sort of plateau and drop off when we were cutting resources, and we cut neighbourhood resources in most forces, and in fact the police community support officers. And I think that loss of connection with people locally, that sense of responsiveness to local issues, is something which we're paying the price for having lost that. So that would be the second thing about, how serious are we about local policing? And, I argued very much that, what was the point of police stations? But the sense in which, I live in an area now where, to drive to my nearest police station, or, it's a long way, even in London. And, in many parts of the country, it's miles and miles. And, we persuaded ourselves that didn't matter. But again,
you think it was a mistake?
Well, I wonder with hindsight, that the cutting of PCSOs, the cutting of neighbourhood teams, all those links, and also actually the links we had with local authorities working on antisocial behaviour, a whole range of activities maybe with local youth provision, the heyday of the community safety partnerships. There was a lot of things we were doing, 28, 9, 10, 11, 12, which we stopped doing, and I fear that we might be paying the price for that. But I think the third thing is that, I look at that Charing Cross case. I mean, I was utterly horrified, and maybe it's something about what's acceptable on social media, maybe it's something about how people behave towards each other, but the sorts of things that were being said, I never experienced that as a constable. That was just
It was never said around you, or in the canteen, or
never.
at the pub at the end of the shift?
No.
Or perhaps they just didn't say it in front of you?
Well, maybe that's the case. But I just don't think it was that bad. But
I think it's worse than it was in, when you were a rookie cop in the 80s, 90s?
Those comments on those WhatsApp messages, I had never heard anything like that. I mean, there was a casual racism in the 80s, of course, about the way people were referred to. And
sexism.
Oh, sure. And the worrying thing about that case is that, I talk a lot to victims groups and women's groups in this role, and I absolutely understand their lack of confidence, the real concern about conviction levels for rape have just gone through the floor. Is it 1.5% now? Really, really low. But I'd always thought about that in terms of, what are the investigative issues, the criminal justice issues, the confidence issues. I'd never tied that to the culture of policing. And I'm just, even I, having been 33 years in policing, worry that, those sorts of attitudes might well be leading to the poor service and poor conviction rates.
Actually affecting decision making.
Well, that's what worries me. It's harder for me to say the two aren't linked when you see that sort of thing side by side, and that's the nature of the challenge. So, I would argue that, you can't tackle the internal culture and external community relations kind of in two different ways. They're two halves of the same coin, aren't they? So you've got to be really thoughtful about, of course, the way we behave inside the organisation, impacts on the service we give to the public, and think about both of them in the round.
Yes, you're right. I mean, perhaps there's a sort of a sense, oh, well, this is just banter between colleagues, but actually if that's infecting how people behave or react or respond to domestic violence incident or an allegation of sexual assault, that, yeah.
So, I mean, maybe I'm going back to kind of passions of 10 years ago, but the issue is about what does it mean to be professional as a police officer? What does that mean in terms of your ethical values? What does that mean in terms of inclusivity and how we treat each other and how everybody matters? What does it mean in terms of kind of general confidence and also, you know, the evidence base? You know, I strongly supported, always did, the link between higher education routes into policing, because I do think that makes for kind of a more thoughtful response. And I know that became very unfashionable, but I think we should be really focusing on what does it mean to be professional in all senses of that word.
Degree? Do you need a degree? Do you need to do a degree qualification on the job or have one before you join?
I think it's helpful. I really do. I also would look at the broader data. If you look at a whole range of outcomes for people who have done degrees and been through higher education, whether it's kind of propensity to violence, whether it's issues about longevity, there's a whole range of kind of human outcomes where actually the results are much stronger for people who have had higher education.
Well, one of the outcomes of the Charing Cross incident and all the others, of course, was the resignation of Dame Cressida Dick as Commissioner. What's your sort of response to that, to what happened? I mean, presumably you're very sad for her personally.
I've known Cressida for well over 30 years, and I can still remember the day I first met her in the canteen in Scotland Yard. She was a newly promoted sergeant and I was a constable, and I was impressed by her then, and I've always been impressed by her. And I think it's, you know, a tragedy. Nobody cared more about policing in London than Cressida. But I think that, you know, she felt that she had no option but to go. And I think that there's a huge gap now, and the hunt for a new commissioner is going to be really difficult, because I think the challenges are enormous. And you know, as I've set out, there are huge confidence challenges in the whole of policing, but I think they're particularly acute in London. And a new commissioner is going to have to focus both internally and externally, and they can't do one and not the other. They've got to do both at the same time.
But Dame Cressida's gone before her contract was up. Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe's last year or two was sort of marked by controversy over his contract extension. Sir Paul Stevenson resigned after a few years. Ian Blair was ousted by the mayor. Is the job just too big? Is it too much? Should it be split up? Should there be a sort of a UK-wide Met job, as it were, and the one that just focuses on policing London? What do you think? Because it just seems that it's just an almost impossible job.
So I think it's the toughest job. There are other jobs in public life that are like this. The jobs at the BBC were always very much like this, the Director General's jobs, weren't they? They're just very tough jobs. I am not at all convinced that splitting it in half between the national and the local would reduce the challenges. I think that people who put themselves forward for that sort of job are doing it because they're offering themselves to public service. And I think all of them go into it with their eyes open and they know it's going to be tough. But they think that if somebody, the Home Secretary, has confidence that they're the person to do the job, then in a way it's your public duty to do it. But you know it's going to be tough. And it might well end in a premature departure.
Do you think there are some good candidates out there? Because you said it's sort of not going to be easy to find someone.
There only has to be one good candidate, one perfect candidate, doesn't there? And I think there are several people who could do a good job.
Any names you want to put out there?
That would be completely inappropriate.
You're not going to throw your hat in the ring?
No.
No, definitely
No.
not.
I mean, you know, I've been out of policing 3 years, and I have really enjoyed that. I've enjoyed developing new skills, developing new networks, finding out new things. Still, when I go back into policing groups, so if I go on a visit to a police force or go to a conference with police officers, I feel at home because I understand their issues and we speak the same language. But I've enjoyed having a different life, and it wouldn't be right for me to go back to it.
Any thoughts about what you're going to do next?
I'm working on a plan.
Okay.
Let's say no more than that at the moment.
Dame Sara Thornton, thank you very much indeed.